So good evening and welcome. My name is Alyssa Banford. I'm the Director of Civic Engagement for the JCRC of St. Louis. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. So first of all, please keep yourselves muted at all times so we can let our speakers go through their content. And for any questions, we highly encourage those. Please add them to the chat box and we will do our best to address them during the Q&A portion of tonight's program. So tonight's program is in part thanks to the Jewish Federation of St. Louis, the Shema Speaker Series, and the Newmark Institute for Human Relations. Celebrating its 10th anniversary, the Newmark Institute of the JCRC was established to continue the lifelong work of Michael and Barbara Newmark in the area of supporting a diverse and pluralistic community. So we are thrilled that you are all here for the first of many upcoming events focused on racial equity. As we engaged in this work, we believe it is imperative to analyze the history of the Jewish community to understand our whole relationship to race, bias, and racism. We know as a community that we cannot move forward towards refuah, healing, without teshuvah, repentance. And we cannot do this without guides. We cannot do it alone. Those with lived experiences, perspectives, and deep knowledge can help us grow as one rich, multiracial, and inclusive community. So with that, I would like to introduce one of our guides and our moderator for tonight's program, our new racial equity consultant, Tariro Nusanov. Tari is a justice practitioner, researcher, and educator who specializes in the psychology of identity and technology in the digital age. Tari immigrated from Zimbabwe at the age of 8 and joined CRC in St. Louis with her family in 2008. Tari was a Hebrew teacher for 10 years, along with being Cultural Leadership's first intern, and most recently their facilitator, virtual troop leader, and program director. Tari has also worked at the JCC and Camp Sabra. Tari received her bachelor's in psychology from Washington University and her master's in program development and clinical social work from Columbia University. At Columbia, Tariro worked on racial justice issues through designing and running participants through a virtual reality simulation. She also worked with the Mayor's Initiative in Harlem, teaching kids how to code. Tariro is currently a PhD student at the University of Southern California studying educational psychology. And in her free time, she likes to run her blog, read, and design her dream house on Pinterest. Sounds amazing. So with that, I will turn this over to Tari.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with y'all this evening, and I'm excited because I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Dollinger, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. So Dr. Marc Dollinger holds the Richard and Rhonda Goldman Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies and Social Responsibility at San Francisco State University. He has served as a research fellow at Princeton's University Center for the Study of Religion, as well as the Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow and lecturer in the Humanities and Bryn Mawr College, where he coordinated the program in Jewish Studies. He is the author of 4 scholarly books in American Jewish history, most recently Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. He has published entries in the Encyclopedia Judaica, the Encyclopedia of Anti-Semitism, and the Encyclopedia of African American Education. His next project traces his own experience fighting campus anti-Semitism at both right-wing and left-wing universities. Dr. Dollinger is a past president of both the Jewish Community High School of the Bay and Brandeis Hillel Day School. He serves on the boards of the Jewish Community Federation, the Oshimarin JCC, and the URJ Camp Newman. He sits on the California Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights, was named Volunteer of the Year by the San Francisco Jewish Community Federation, and was awarded the San Francisco JCRC's Courageous Leader Award. And just for fun, Professor Dollinger helped actress Helen Hunt learn about her Jewish roots on the primetime NBC show, Who Do You Think You Are? And with that, I'm gonna leave the space open, and we have a lot to learn tonight, so I'm really excited. So The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Let me get my screen share going. And we're going to start this afternoon with a pop quiz. All right, let's go back to 1963. It is the conservative movement's Rabbinic Assembly National Convention. At that point, it was all men. And as they were doing what many Jewish organizations were doing in the 60s, passing resolutions to support Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the civil rights movement, there was a group of rabbis who said, if we are really serious about fighting for civil rights, we shouldn't just sit here at our conference and pass a resolution. We should, in fact, end our conference early, get on airplanes, go down to Birmingham, Alabama, where Dr. King was planning a march, and literally march with him. Well, they didn't end up canceling or shortening the meeting, but about a dozen rabbis did go down. One of them was Rabbi Richard Winograd, who was then the interim director of the University of Chicago, Hillel. And so if you see this is a t-shirt in front of you, and if you can read the Hebrew phonetics, it does indeed say Chicago. So that's the official University of Chicago Hillel shirt. Well, when he got to the South, there's my Southern Jews, shalom y'all, for those of you who are from the South on your way to St. Louis. Well, when he was met at the airport in Birmingham, he saw Southern Jews who were none too happy with the fact that these rabbis had traveled to the South. As the rabbi wrote in his diary that he later published in an article, he said, I had the feeling that we somehow were the Hamans and Torquemadas to Southern Jews. Haman, of course, from the Purim story. Torquemada was the chief inquisitor in the Spanish Inquisition of 1492. So it's clear that these conservative movement rabbis knew that for some Southern Jews, at least, they were not welcome. So here is our trivia, our quiz for you, and I'm going to open my chat so I can see. The question is, what would you have said to those Southern Jews who were protesting the fact that you had come down to march with Dr. King? So if you have access to your chat, you could feel free just to type in an answer, and then you could see. Okay. Shulamit is letting us know that JFK, of course, in November of 1963 was assassinated. For context of that time, yes, absolutely. When these dozen rabbis were there, oh, why do you find my presence offensive, Nancy tells us. Make it say them out loud, right? So absolutely, if we have a Northern rabbi interested in social justice to the point that Winograd was, he certainly should have said that. Well, I was shocked to discover, and by the way, that's exactly the answer that I thought he should have given. And then sitting in the archives, he said, or he wrote, from a moral point of view, the scales were very even. How is it possible that a rabbi, not to mention a rabbi going down to march with Dr. King, could possibly see that comparing his work with Southern white Jews who were racist, that the scales were very even? As he wrote, I was not fully convinced that we had a right to place the Jewish community of Birmingham in a more dangerous position than we're willing and able to place ourselves. For this rabbi, the worst part of that interaction was not that there were Southern Jews who didn't back Dr. King. The worst part was what he called the circumstances which had led to pitting Jew against Jew. This was a case of Klal Yisrael. All of Israel is responsible one for another. And in this moment, this rabbi understood that he had just divided Jews. He had just placed himself in between those who supported the civil rights movement and those who didn't. Well, I was stunned by that response. It framed not only that chapter, which turned out to be my dissertation in my first book, but it's really informed my entire approach to Jewish social justice. And that's going to be our guiding light for today. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. Thank you to Tari, Alyssa, everybody, Maharat, all of you who helped to organize this. There's been a lot of planning and I'm really excited to be here. I was just gonna say that there was one brief moment when I could have had like a really good, strong connection to St. Louis. My daughter, when she was applying to colleges, had WashU as one of only 2 schools left to pick from, which meant, of course, the entire family got on a plane and went out and did a great tour of St. Louis and saw a very impressive campus. As it turns out, she picked Wesleyan, so now I'll just have opportunities to come back to St. Louis as a tourist. Well, for each of my lectures, I always offer an historical question. And thank you for telling folks to take notes. I'm impressed. I don't always get people taking notes on the Zoom calls. So if you are taking notes, here is my obligation. And Tari has been very clear that I need to be done by midnight your time, so I'll be sure to hold it within that 4-hour limit. So thank you for the laugh, I appreciate that too. I know we got a DNC convention coming up too. A lot of people want to go in here. So the question is, what best explains Jewish participation in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. My thesis, in a challenge to accepted notions of Jews and social justice, participation in the civil rights struggles of the post-war era reflected American Jews' movement into the mainstream more than it revealed heroic selflessness. The very few Jews who risked power and privilege for the benefit of African Americans emerged as heroes, but most of their brethren remained on the sidelines of activism. And I'll just say that Shulamit, who had lived in Atlanta, is describing how frightening it was for Southern Jews. So Shulamit, you're gonna get my Radar O'Reilly Award for today. If you don't remember the old TV show MASH, Radar O'Reilly always predicted what was coming, and you're about 15 minutes ahead of where I'll be, but I'll get back to you in one moment. So at the end of today's lecture, if you can self-assess, you should be able to describe Jewish involvement in civil rights in both the South and the North, compare and contrast the rationales for Jewish participation in each of those regions, and then assess the limits and possibilities of Jewish social justice in the 50s and the 60s. I offer this to my undergraduates for every lecture so that they can track themselves as they're going, and hopefully when they're leaving the day's lecture, they can review these 3 and see if they've sort of got what they need to have. All right, get your chat box ready if you'd like to see how you'll do in the pop quiz to come. Just to let you know, this is an easy question, and the question is, what's the definition of history? Go ahead and type it if you'd like. But I'll just tell you that this is really a warm-up for the more challenging questions to come, because history is simply the study of the past. Now, we could be a little bit more pointed and look at a gender view, his story, because the truth is, prior to the 1970s, when second wave feminism got women into graduate programs and writing dissertations, most of the history written was by and about men. But that said, history we generally see as the study of the past. This is a more complicated one. So if you are a former history major, you are not allowed to go to the chat box. But if you're watching with somebody else, you can share with them how smart you are that you know the answer to this question, and they will be very impressed with you. If you are a former English major, you can look at the etymology of this word and try to figure it out. Now, remember, this is my motto from the late Rabbi Professor Michael Signer, Notre Dame. It was his last institution. Why use a monosyllabic when a polysyllabic will do? So let's go back to our polysyllabic. And one moment, I'm trying to go backwards here. Yes, historiography. It's this word here. It says graph. To graph is to write. Historiography is the history of historical writing. Because as it turns out, about every 20 years, history changes. Actually, history doesn't change every 20 years, but the way in which academic historians look at history does change. Because we bring ourselves to our work. Or, as Professor Joyce Appleby of blessed memory, my first grad school professor at UCLA, I know Tara, you're across town at USC, as Professor Appleby taught us, history is more a study of the present's relationship to the past than the past itself, which is to say we are all in relationship to our own history. As much as I try to be as dispassionate, third person, critical, analyzing academic, I am also a product of my gender, my race, ethnicity, religion, generation, like whatever identity category you want to put in there. And for that reason, I am going to write from that perspective. So the way it works in graduate school is you read all the books you read, and your job is to basically call all of these brilliant scholars idiots. Because you want to write a dissertation and get it published, and in order to do that, you have to prove that the way they looked at that historical moment is all wrong, and you at like 24 years old, you're so smart, you know the right way to do it, and then you're going to write your dissertation and then try to make a career of it. So by the way, that's really a lot of hubris to do that. I'm in middle age now, and now I'll say that there's a lot of humility, because now that my books are getting read in graduate school, then I know that the critique is coming my way, but we'll have more on that later tonight and next week. Historiography is a little complex, and I just want to tell you that I'm not going to give you tonight and next week a history of Jews and civil rights. I'm going to give you the historiography of it. We're going to look at the way in which different generations of historians have examined the same question, because the meta question, the bigger one, the university level question, actually I think will be more revealing to us than the actual facts of that time. So let's imagine that you are an undergraduate at the University of Alabama in 1840. And by the way, you'd have to be white if you were going to be an undergraduate at Bama in 1840. And let's say that you are in the US History Survey class that's required of everyone. And it's the week you're learning about slavery, and you have to read the textbook chapter on slavery, and your textbook was published by University of Alabama Press. What do you think it's going to say about the history of slavery? Well, I'll tell you, it's going to be pretty complimentary, because this is the University of Alabama Press in 1840. In fact, through the 1840s, there were what was described as 6 positive goods arguments that were made to defend slavery. All right, just for fun, let's move you to Boston University in 1860, 20 years later, and now you're in the North. Same US History Survey. Your textbook, though, of course, is published by Boston University Press, and you're required to read the chapter on slavery. What's it going to say? Boston was the center of the abolitionist movement. Of course, it's going to say that slavery was an awful institution. So just for fun, let's put those 2 textbook chapters side by side. Let's have the reader not know anything about anything, just go read those 2 chapters. They wouldn't even know they're reading about the same historical event. That, to me, is the most dramatic illustration of historiography, of what it is that academic historians do. All right, here's a trivia question. You could impress your friends. Now, you're keeping socially distant, I know, but however you're going to interact with others, go ahead and ask them, what is the most historiographically rich field in Jewish studies? Which means, what topic in Jewish studies gets more academic pages published than any other? We'd like to think it's Torah or Tanakh, Hebrew Bible. Sadly and truthfully, it's Shoah, Holocaust studies, because that's the biggest topic. So I would like to introduce to you next to my favorite polysyllabic. And here it is, filio-pietistic. Anyone? I'll give you a hint. It's from the Latin. Oh, still not anything. Okay, here it is. Piety is love. Filio, technically brother, can also be family. Love of one's own family. In academics, it means ethnic self-congratulations. In Jewish studies, it means, aren't the Jews great? Aren't they? We're great. I'll tell you how great we are. I know how great we are because about every 3 weeks, I get an email reminding me how many Jews have won the Nobel Prize. That's how I know how great Jews are. So here's how filiopietism works. The first generation of historical writing in any ethnic studies field, Black studies, Jewish studies, women's studies, Latino, American Indian studies, LGBTQ, it's all filiopietistic because if you're the first generation of scholars to ever write the history of your group, you have to capture all the contributions that your group made to society. That's the point of having ethnic studies or area studies. Of course, once a whole lot of those books have been written and the next generation of grad students come in, they're going to have to write books that say, aren't Jews bad, right? Because they have to disagree with the earlier one. Then you get a whole generation of aren't Jews bad books. And then the third generation, well, they're going to say, stop bickering back and forth. First two generations, the truth, it's somewhere in the middle. And they'll write their complex somewhere in the middle books. And then, of course, that leaves the fourth generation with the problem. What do? Well, they say, nah, I think it's actually all about the environment. And then they challenge everything and write about Jews in the environment. So here is the challenge. Tari, Alyssa, you'll be our judges, whoever it's going to be. You all have 1 week. And in the next week, you must use the phrase filiopietistic historiographic analysis in regular ongoing conversation. You can't say that, oh, I went to this great Zoom lesson and I learned about filiopietistic historiographic analysis. That's too easy. You have to create an ongoing conversation for which the phrase filiopietistic historiographic analysis naturally occurs. And then I'll tell you, send an email to our leadership here and I will mail you a prize if you can do it. And then I'll brag about you to the next Zoom call that I do. So just so you know, I have a little fun with the word filiopietistic. And in my Black Power book that I'll talk about next week, I put the word in 3 times just for fun. And the editors came back and told me I had to take it out because no one knows what it means. And I said, oh, that's the whole point, right? So it turns out if you want to know what a word means, you can go up the internet and like do the online dictionary. And when you go on the online dictionary, it gives you a place where you can write where you saw the word. So I literally one day just looked up the definition and somebody had read the book, thank you, Virginia, and put a little comment there. So I am just getting major points. My students, they get a prize if they can say filiopietistic in one of my colleagues' classrooms. And my colleagues, of course, know that it's coming. So what we're going to do today is look at historiography, and we're going to challenge filiopietism. And we'll begin, of course, with this iconic image of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and I think that's John Lewis on the far left, I believe. So I think this is a pretty impressive photograph. So now okay. The good news, I know we're recording this, but it's okay because I do have tenure. I'm now going to speak some uncomfortable truth to you, but not to worry. This is only the beginning of a whole lot of uncomfortable truth that we'll get in the next 2 weeks. So the question is, why did American Jews get involved in the civil rights movement? What was the rationale, what academic historians call causality? What caused this historical moment to occur? I will give you from the Filiopietistic Historiographic School of Thought, see how I just worked that in, the reasons why. Reason number 1, a common history. That's to say, Blacks and Jews share a common history of oppression. And if you are an inheritor of that kind of history, it only makes sense that you will reach across racial lines in this case in order to help one another. That's the history argument. Number 2, the sociology argument, and that's related to the history argument. Sociology argument says that Blacks and Jews both know what it is to be marginal in society, to be sociologically considered outsiders. So when you have 2 groups of outsiders, it is only natural that they will come together to fight for inclusion. And back in the day when we could travel and actually be face-to-face and I would have an opportunity to actually see you and ask you these questions, people often come up with a history and sociology argument. Sadly, they don't come up with the 3rd reason why Jews should help Blacks in the civil rights movement. And are you ready for this answer? Judaism. Yes, the religion of the Jews, especially in the Reform movement, where Tikkun Olam, fixing the world, has become, and I'll just say this as a Reform Jew, my 2 favorite words in the English language, Tikkun Olam, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice we shall pursue, that the religion of the Jews mandates engagement in social justice. So it makes a lot of sense that this would be why history happened the way it did. What is this you're looking at now? It may be the 25th letter of the English alphabet. But no, let's challenge ourselves. I would say this is a visual depiction of the filiopietistic historiographic analysis which has plagued our understanding of Black-Jewish relations in the post-war period. Wouldn't you agree? Okay, we'll explain it. As you can see my cursor on the upper left-hand corner, we'll put African Americans here. We'll put white Jews over here on the right. And as you can see, they're apart from one another. But look what happens. As time passes, and we get to the center of the Y, Blacks and Jews have come together. This is King and Heschel right here. This is the march at Selma, and look what happens. They march together through time. Peace, love, Bobby Sherman, kumbaya. Isn't that great? It doesn't matter what book you would have read in that first historiographic generation. It's the letter Y. They're all going to have this as the controlling thesis. And then a new generation of grad students re-looked at the sources in a new way. And here's what they discovered. Let's take the history argument. All right, so one of my colleagues, an African-American scholar of ethnicity and race, who also happened to be back in the day the chair of the state of New Jersey's Black-Jewish Dialogue, which meant he got invited to a lot of Passover Seders in his day. And he said to me one day when we're talking about this, he said, if another white Jew tells me that they know what it's like to be a Black man in America, because they too were slaves in the land of Egypt, I'm going to scream. While it may be true that Jews were slaves in the ancient period, the history argument doesn't hold in the United States. The American Jewish historical experience has been phenomenal. Jews moving up the social mobility ladder even by the second generation. And as we know, especially now in recent months, the African-American experience historically in this country started in slavery and then went into institutional racism from there. So there actually isn't a common history. And a new generation of scholars had to rewrite the versions of Black Jewish history to acknowledge that. Sociology. Turns out that white presenting Jews, Jews who look like me, were actually not considered white for a lot of American Jewish history. It's one of the interesting things about whiteness. It's actually not just the color of your skin, though of course the color of your skin has a whole lot to do with it if you're not presenting as white. Jews were considered non-white up until 1945 or so. At least this is where most of the scholars, Eric Goldstein and Karen Brodkin, are the two leading scholars on this topic. And what Professor Goldstein, who's at Emory, argues is that only in the 1950s, only when American Jews moved into the mainstream, got into the white suburbs, was able to get into graduate schools and go into the professional life, only then were they able to join the civil rights movement. That in the 20s and 30s, at a time when Jews actually shared a lot more in common sociologically with Black Americans, that was not the time that it happened. So with that, we now need to throw away reason number 2. And now let's look at Judaism. If it turns out that Judaism inspires participation in civil rights, then we should see the Orthodox community as the most engaged, because this is a community for which normative halakha, Jewish law, is guiding their every single day in all of their behaviors. But as we know, the Orthodox community was all but absent from the civil rights struggle in the 50s and the 60s. The conservative movement, not so much. Rabbi Heschel, the most famous from the conservative movement, but what we've often forgotten over the years is that Rabbi Heschel was actually purged in many ways from his own colleagues at the Jewish Theological Seminary for having been engaged in civil rights and later in the anti-Vietnam War protests. They did not consider this a good use of their colleagues' time. Among the denominations, it was Reform Judaism that was most involved in civil rights, but to be perfectly honest, it was actually Jewish socialists and even a few Jewish communists who were the ones most likely to head south. They typically did not go down with Jewish organizations. And if we're going to take the Jewish communists as an example, in their minds, they were against organized religion. So it turns out there was an inverse relationship between level of religiosity and commitment to the civil rights movement. So now we have an historiographic problem. The three foundations of the original argument now no longer work. So what we have is a new generation of books that are the letter X. So under this theory, Black Americans here, white Jews here, they're apart. Oh, look, they come together. Starting about 1954, that's the Brown decision, the Montgomery bus boycott. But guess what? The Black-Jewish Alliance only lasts about 10 years. 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act, rise of Black power that we'll talk about next week. All of that ends the Black-Jewish Alliance, and Black Americans go in this direction, Jewish Americans go in this direction, and look where we are today, or at least where we were a few months ago. We can perhaps in Q&A this week or next week talk about the chance that maybe even this historiographic field is now dated. But the histories had to account for the fact that the Y didn't work anymore. And now we needed to see it as an X, which means if you read everything written in the second historiographic generation, no matter what the book is, it's going to show you we were apart, we came together, we split up, and then everybody will have their own story on how that happened. So let's walk through, if we can, these examples. And we'll start with Southern Jews. Most think that support of the civil rights movement is a Jewish position. As it turns out, that wasn't actually true, as the intro with Rabbi Winograd told you, not for Southern Jews. And here's how in the historiography, most history professors dealt with Southern Jews. They ignored them. And why not? The South should be ignored. I don't believe that. I'm just giving you the earlier arguments, you see, because if most of the Jews were in the North, and if the greater New York City area was really the demographic hub of American Jewish life, and you had a relatively small number of Southern Jews scattered throughout the South, and they were not behaving properly as Jews, certainly when it comes to social justice and civil rights, then just don't write about them. All right, so that was like the first way to deal with them. The next generation said, okay, all right, I know we have to deal with them, but they really don't count. So what we're going to do is put them in a footnote. So in the text, it would say, Jews supported the civil rights movement, footnote. You go down to the footnote. Okay, not all Jews did. There are some in the South, they didn't. Okay, go back to my book, and that's how we're going to dispense with Southern Jews. I decided when I wrote my first book that I was going to try to be historiographically significant. I was going to try to challenge the way earlier generations had looked at Southern Jews. And I decided to give Southern Jews exactly the same number of words in the chapter as Northern Jews. 50-50. So I wrote my chapter, I turned it into my doctoral committee, and the sad news is every single member of my doctoral committee rejected my chapter. It's not a good day when all 4 members of your doctoral committee reject you independently and for the same reason. But the good news is they actually rejected me for a good reason. They said, Mark, you actually came up with an argument that I don't even think you came up with. And it's true because I didn't know. They said that I wrote about how Southern Jews opposed the civil rights movement. And they opposed the civil rights movement, ironically, for the same reason Northern Jews supported the movement. In fact, the model for Jewish political behavior was created in the South. Northerners, a decade later, embraced the Southern position. Rather than ignoring Southern Jews or putting them in a footnote or even giving them 50-50, they said I needed to put Southern Jews into the center of the argument, and no one in the scholarship had ever put Southern Jews in the center. And they said, by the way, Mark, you're an historian, and the Southern story is in the 1950s, the Northern story is in the 1960s. It just makes sense to start in the 50s and then go to the 60s. So that's what that chapter ended up doing, and here's how that worked. There were some white Southern Jews who were outright racist. Not a lot, but they were the ones who joined the White Citizens Council. Most Southern Jews, while they privately maybe would have supported the idea of racial equality, decided that they needed to do it quietly. In fact, the book that was published on this was even called quiet voices. And this is one on Southern rabbis and Black civil rights. It's a survey from the 19th to the 20th century. So I just want you to know, I went to Montgomery, Alabama, and delivered a paper, which ultimately became this chapter in the book. And the editors of this book got excited. They wanted me to publish, my chapter in their book. And that's always exciting as a grad student to get to do that until they read my chapter. You see, I thought I was being really nice to Southern Jews. 50% time, you're getting first promotion. You are the center. The Northern Jews are following you. I thought that I would be really popular south of the Mason-Dixon line. Apparently, I was still too critical of Southern Jews. Fortunately for me, they decided that they don't need to agree with the thesis of every one of the chapters in their edited collection, and they agreed to publish it. So if you happen to see the book, you don't really have to read the chapter I wrote, but I think it would be fun to look in the intro where the two editors have to give a one-paragraph summary of each of the chapters and see how they described in one paragraph what I wrote. Well, here's how we can better understand the Southern Jewish recalcitrance around civil rights. Demographics first. In Montgomery, in this period, there were only 1,800 Jews in a larger population of 134,000. In Birmingham, there were only 4,000 Jews in a population of 630,000. So the statistics in other Southern towns were very similar to this. And as you're probably aware, many Jews living in small towns, especially in the Deep South, were involved in business. They had general stores, they were merchants. And you see, if they were to support the civil rights movement, they would face boycotts by the local whites, and vice versa if they decided the opposite way. They needed to get business from both sides. So they needed to navigate for their own financial success some way of having a quiet voice, as it were, in civil rights. Rabbi Milton Grafman in Birmingham, and I actually say, I want to give credit to the late Rabbi Alan Krause, of blessed memory, passed away long before his time. In 1965, when he was a rabbinic student at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, he did his rabbinic thesis on Southern Reform rabbis and civil rights. And he went to the South and sat with a whole bunch of rabbis to ask them really challenging questions. And of course, these rabbis were not too interested in being too honest with this young rabbinic student for fear that it would be a threat to their congregations, to their professions, even to their health. So he struck a deal. He said that when he wrote his rabbinic thesis, he would do it in code. He would not say the name of the rabbi or the name of the congregation or city. He'd use like letters and numbers instead. And only when the threat against these rabbis were gone would he release the key to it. So when I sat in the archives and found his rabbinic thesis, and it was fantastic, these quotes, and meaningless to me without knowing who said them and where, I reached out to Rabbi Krause. Now, the good news is that his son was my camper when I was a Jewish summer camp counselor. It's a very small Jewish world. And he was in Jerusalem on sabbatical at that time. So I took out what used to be called a fax machine, and I sent him a fax and asked him for permission. And he released the key to me, so I was able to publish it. So I just want to Rabbi Krause offer this as a memorial to him and to appreciate his work. Because he found, when he interviewed Rabbi Grafman said that congregants were, quote, caught in a vice between the Negroes and the whites. They couldn't win for losing. You see, anti-Semitism also was a grave threat to Jews in the South. The lynching of Leo Frank from 1913 was in the lived memory of Southern Jews. Rabbi Jacob Rothschild, here's Milton Grafman, now we go. Here's Rabbi Jacob Rothschild, along with his wife Janice, and of course, Dr. Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. He was rabbi of what's called the Temple in Atlanta, and I think someone here is from Atlanta. Shulamit was living in Atlanta. His synagogue was bombed in October of 1958. And when he was interviewed about it, he said that he believed that the bombing occurred in part, quote, because I was so obviously identified with the civil rights movement. Now, Janice Rothschild is actually in her 90s now. I had the wonderful privilege to get to deliver this lecture once to her and to talk about her late husband. So that was great. This is Rabbi William Maliff, who was the rabbi of the conservative movement's largest congregation in Houston. And when confronted with the question of civil rights, he wrote, "The rabbis have not spoken out, and to have done so would have been to invite resentment and anti-Semitism, if not indeed violence towards the Jewish community." Moses Landau, I couldn't find Rabbi Landau, but this is his synagogue in Cleveland, Mississippi. He said that if he decided to support the civil rights movement, quote, "it would have been limited to 24 hours. After that single day," he said, "I wouldn't be there in the state anymore. The Jewish community could not exist if they in any way involved in the civil movement." Well, things came to a head in the summer of 1961. A whole lot of Northerners came down, which means a whole lot of Northern Jews came down to fight in the civil rights movement. And as one activist reflected, "The Jews of this Mississippi town are not happy that I am here. Too many of us civil rights workers are Jews, it seemed." Well, this is Rabbi Roland Gitelson. He was rabbi then of Temple Israel of Boston. And a lot of his congregants had gone down to Mississippi in 61 to register voters and to do a lot of grassroots organizing. Some of them got arrested. They got brought to the prison in Parchman, Mississippi. And now Rabbi Gitelson is trying to find a way to get communication to the kids in jail. This is, of course, before the internet and all the rest of it. So he reaches out to Rabbi Perry Nussbaum, who was the rabbi who lived closest to the Parchman prison, and said, would you go, would you meet the kids, would you communicate some messages back and forth and help me out, which of course Rabbi Nussbaum was happy to do. After some time though, it got to be literally a scheduling challenge for him to be making constant trips to Parchman while still being a rabbi in his own congregation. So he decided that he'd reach out to his colleagues, the other rabbis of Mississippi, invite them over to his home, sit down and chat and see if they could just come up with a schedule. I don't know, like every week a different rabbi would go and do jail visitations. And this way they could sort of share the time burdens that would be. It turns out he unwittingly violated the South's unwritten rules on race. Rabbi Moses Landau of Cleveland, Mississippi, condemned him for any of it. He saw no reason to even have a meeting of rabbis. He opposed jail visitations by what he called uninvited rabbis. And uninvited means the prison warden didn't ask you to come. Unless the warden says, "We need you, Rabbi," you don't show up. And here's what he wrote. "It is your privilege to be a martyr. There are dozens of vacant pulpits. You can pick yourself up within 24 hours and leave. Can you say the same of about 1,000 Jewish families in the state? I am paid by my congregation, and as long as I eat their bread, I shall not do anything that might harm any member of my congregation without their consent." Alan Schwartzman of Greenville, Mississippi. "I'm wondering whether we as local rabbis would not be harming our people, our positions as rabbis in our communities, and the good work we're doing for the racial problems of Mississippi by going to bat for these temporary inmates." Even those who supported Rabbi Nussbaum understood what was going on. Rabbi Sidney Goldstein of Meridian, "Blessings on you. You make me feel very proud that the rabbinate comes up with people like you." Rabbi Charles Mantenband did accept the invitation, but the meeting never happened. He had to cancel it for lack of interest. At Rabbi Nussbaum's own congregation, the board of directors, quote, uneasily, unquote, consented to the visits, but they told the rabbi that he needed to let everybody know that this was done, quote, without identification of my congregation. Some congregants registered their disapproval by resigning their memberships. Others registered their disapproval with the local sheriff. The civil rights movement was complicated for Southern Jews. For them, they didn't enjoy the privilege of just getting to decide if they wanted to help or not help. And they had to mediate that around the real lived experiences of what it was to be a white Jew in the South. White certainly enjoying privilege, and Jew certainly being fearful, especially if they supported the civil rights movement. So Now let's move north and see how and why Northern Jews may have more in common with their Southern brethren and not even realize it. So actually, before we get to the quote, here's a little research trick I learned, all right? So most of the scholars who study civil rights started in the mid-50s because that's when the civil rights movement really gets going. And I said, if I'm going to look to find evidence that hasn't already been written or published or evidence that might cause us to rethink things, I want to look at civil rights when nobody knew civil rights was going on. So I pushed my research back to 1945 and looked at everything I could. And then I found this document. And I've done two things to this document. I've taken away the person who wrote it, and I've taken away the year. So we're going to talk through the document, and then you can guess, and anytime if you want to put into the chat who you think would have said it, you can. And here's the background. The United States federal government was considering giving money to public schools, federal aid to education. As you may be aware, education is really a function of state governments, not federal government. But, and I will tell you, this is 1947, after World War II, there was a movement to get the federal government to put in money because of the Cold War. And the feeling is that we won't be able to beat the Soviet Union and the communists if we can't train our students because our schools are not funded well enough. So here is testimony to the Senate Subcommittee on Education regarding a bill to give federal money in 1947. A segregated system is not merely an unfair system, but it is a wasteful and inefficient system. Nevertheless, we do not believe that a federal law to equalize educational opportunities by public subsidy should be used as a means to attack the segregated school system. So long as the law guarantees that states having segregated school systems do not discriminate financially against the children in the minority schools, we believe that the bill should be supported. Okay, so this is a special shout out to all the people that went to law school who are listening today. Because in 1954, the famous Brown decision concluded that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. That was a phrase the court used, inherently unequal. Because, and here's my trivia question, do you know the name of the Supreme Court case that the Brown decision overturned? If you're watching with someone else, you can tell them because they'll be very impressed with your brain, or you can type it into the chat if you'd like. There we go. Larissa has it correct. Plessy, yes, you got it right. Plessy versus Ferguson. Nancy gets it as Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. And even if you didn't have time to type it in, I believe you. You get a virtual prize for today. In 1896, it wasn't education. It was actually interstate railroad transport. And the ruling said that it was okay to have racially segregated overnight sleeping railroad cars, so long as you gave the same amount of money to each side. Well, the truth is, they never gave the same amount of money to each side. And as the Brown decision told us in 54, even if they did, it didn't matter because it would still be inherently unequal. So this statement says, so long as the law guarantees that the states having segregated systems do not discriminate financially, they think that the bill should be supported. So this is Plessy. So the question is, now you don't have to know the exact name, but what kind of person is going to be arguing for Plessy? I'll give you my initial thought: a white, male, racist, bigoted senator who is going to support Jim Crow segregation. So let's look at the picture of that person. Oh my goodness, there he is, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, the founder of the Free Synagogue of New York, probably one of the most important rabbis of his generation, personal friends with Franklin D. Roosevelt, leader of the American Zionist movement, along with Abba Hillel Silver from Cleveland. Rabbi Stephen S. Wise is not a marginal rabbi who did the wrong thing. He was in the center of American Jewish life. And he backed Plessy, not knowing that Brown was coming, but he was arguing against Brown. And he's a Northern rabbi from New York City and one of the leading social justice advocates. Oh no, how could it be? Let's go back to the quote. And now I'll give you the backstory so it makes more sense. Rabbi Weiss found out that the Senate was considering federal funding for public schools. And he got on a train in New York and went down to DC, of course. That's a Jewish position. That's a rabbinic position. It's all great. And he gave his testimony just like that. And then when he finished his testimony, that's when the Southern senators approached him. And they said, Rabbi, they said, we know what's going to happen if federal dollars come into our schools in the South. You're all going to try to undo Jim Crow. So here's the thing. We are going to create an amendment to the bill. And the amendment's going to say, not a penny is going to go to black schools unless the white South wants it to. Well, this is not what the rabbi wanted. He did not come to DC to talk about race. He came to talk about funding public education. That said, the senators told him, they said, if this amendment doesn't pass, this bill will never pass because we won't even let it out of committee. And now Rabbi Stephen S. Wise has an impossible choice. He is either going to agree to the Plessy case, to get the bill out of committee, to get it onto the floor, to get it passed, to get money out there, to help kids in America. Or he's going to take a stand for racial justice. And the consequence of that stand is no child will get any money for anything. And as you can see, he made his call. And now I want to go back to that opening sentence. He wants everyone to know at the very beginning, a segregated system is not merely an unfair system, but it is wasteful and inefficient. This is his way of letting everyone know he doesn't like what he's doing. And then he made his deal, nevertheless, comma. And he agreed to the compromise. This is called white liberal gradualism. That's the fancy sociological word, which is to say, America's not a revolutionary country. We're much more about slow, progressive, liberal reform, step by step. And perhaps in Rabbi Weiss's mind, it was like, I can't help all the kids right now, but let's help as many kids as I can. And then we're going to deal with black kids as a next step, right? And this is indeed a lot of what the history of race and race relations have been, right? This struggle between liberalism and radicalism, between gradualism and trying to get everything done all at once. So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was 18 years old when this happened. And he, of course, wasn't in the room, but let's just for academic fun, let's put him in the room and let's have these two senators talk to him. If he was offered this deal, would he have agreed? I don't think he would have agreed at all. His whole point was racial justice and equity. He wanted to undo Jim Crow. Not only did this amendment not undo it, it actually doubled down. It actually made Jim Crow even more strong, even stronger in the law. So this is where we see a fundamental difference between the privilege that white Jews enjoy and the challenges that black leaders had in trying to deal with this is actually legal segregation even before we get to the de facto segregation. And I would argue that the moment Stephen S. Wise faced getting drawn into the racial politics in the North is actually a very similar kind of moment than the Southern Jews. Well, in the 1950s, for the first time, anti-Semitic restrictions against Jews eased. There were, and you probably heard about the no Jews or dogs allowed signs, that the white suburbs had anti-Jewish and anti-Black housing covenants on them. But in the 1950s, two things happened. One, Jews enjoyed economic success and mobility for lots of reasons. And two, anti-Semitism began to decline. Certainly there was sporadic anti-Semitism in the 40s and in the 50s, but by 1960, rates of domestic anti-Semitism had dropped to the point that they no longer inhibited American Jews as a group from upward advance. And here this image is Levittown. Levittown you may be familiar with, especially if you're from the East Coast, a Jewish real estate developer. The first Levittown was in Pennsylvania. And the idea here was that for a very low cost, you could buy yourself a house and move out of the cities. And so many American Jews did. And it was a great realization of the American dream. And at least in the earlier historiographic treatments of 1950s post-war American Jewish life, this story was told as an easing of anti-Semitic barriers and economic mobility, and how great it was for the Jews to finally make it into America. Except, guess what? Even though the anti-Semitic restrictions were lifted, the anti-Black ones had not. Now, the US Supreme Court did quickly rule that these restrictions were unconstitutional, but that said, there were still informal ways by which these white suburban neighborhoods maintained their whiteness over the decades. So now, Jews, merely by achieving the American dream and wanting to do nothing overtly racist, are now living in the midst of a whites-only racist suburban neighborhood. Well, in 1951, 3 years before Brown and before too many scholars were looking, the Anti-Defamation League was concerned about this and wanted to know the extent to which suburban Jewish organizations were following the racism of the white Christian majority that preceded it. So they went to all the JCCs and they studied them and to figure out if they were racially exclusive. Now, the first issue was half of the JCCs would only admit Jews. So we don't know whether they would have been racially exclusive. And I know of no cases of Black Jews who would have tried to get admission as a Jew, and whether or not they would have been excluded as a Black, that's an interesting question. But for the half of the JCCs that would admit Christians, that didn't have Jewish as a standard, half of those were racially exclusive, which meant that Jews tended to model and mimic the political culture in the northern white suburbs in the same way that Southern Jews were mimicking what was going on south of the Mason-Dixon line. And I just want you to know, and it was not done specifically for this talk, but it is published in my first book, one of your great social justice leaders, Herman Kaplow, gave this quote. Perhaps as part of the total and gradual process of acculturation, the idea developed that it would be in the best interest of the Jewish community for Jewish centers to serve non-Jews. But Herman Kaplow said, they did so in most instances following the precept of the majority community, whites only. Richard Bluestein said the problem of Jewish exclusion of Blacks had become increasingly acute. Mike Israel, a civil rights activist in the JCRC, I think he was in Cincinnati, said, there was a strong feeling that as Jews we had enough trouble. We should not get involved in Black problems. Well, I argue that it was in fact the quest for inclusion, the desire for Jews to fit in the culture where they were in, that determined how they looked at social justice and how they looked at civil rights. That the South and the North really were the same, even though they landed on opposite sides of Dr. King's efforts. And Rabbi Winograd knew it. He knew that even though he was pro-civil rights and those white Southern Jews who met him were anti, he knew that he did not have a higher moral ground on them. Because I think he knew that if he was a rabbi or born and raised in the South, he would have sounded a lot like those Southern rabbis that I quoted as well. So sometimes to be at peace as a Jew in America means that you support racial justice. Sometimes it means that you don't. And in each case, we have to look at the historiography and see if we can figure things out anew. And with that, I thank you, and I turn it over to Tari, however you would like to proceed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dollinger. That was a really important and necessary lesson. I'm going to ask you like 2 questions, and then I can open up the floor to everybody else. If you'd like, you can type them out in the chat, and then I can ask them out loud. So my first question kind of speaks more to our current climate and the current moment that we're all living in, especially white Jews, these conversations about anti-Blackness, whiteness, and anti-Semitism. And I'm wondering for you, after, I guess, you're an expert in this, what do you think that white Jews can do to be more impactful and in these moments, especially in 2020?
Thank you. Excellent question. I'll give you my joke answer first, then I'll give you a serious answer.
Okay.
The joke answer is that I'm an historian. It's tough enough to predict the past. So what I'll do is I'll just say in terms of my professional work, because my research is based on the sources, and now I'm just going to speak to you as someone who studied the sources just from my own perspective so that I can still stay in the history professor union when we're done. What I'm trying to do literally with these talks this summer is introduce folks to a new historiographic understanding of the history. And that's to say, which is the first step, right? The first step is to pause. The next step is to reflect, which is to say that we have flattened our understanding of white Jewish participation in civil rights, and we have missed a whole lot of complexity and subtlety. And if we are open to listening and to reflecting, and I just want to credit everybody for coming this afternoon and for hearing this, that these can be ways that we can find new pathways to understand what actually happened and then what that meant. So what does it mean in order for today? So first pause, reflect, learn, and then the last step is to act. And the acting is going to be, okay, now that I'm understanding that the history is different than I thought, now I'm going to look at myself and all of us, counting myself as well as a white Jew, to figure out sort of where we live, where we go to school, how we get medical care, like every sector of society is informed by the history I described and by the complex dynamics of what it was to be an American Jew in the 20th and now 21st century. Then what I'm telling folks is, whatever your personal interest or professional expertise is, go start there. So I happen to be, a scholar of this, so I'm like doing Zoom lectures everywhere. That's my piece because I think it's important. I bet we've got a whole lot of lawyers here in the group, and there's a whole lot of legal inequity issues going on around systemic racism. In the healthcare system, anyone who's a medical professional, go find organizations that are seeing what they can do, and then we go from there.
Thank you. And then my final question, I guess, going off of what you just said, in pausing and reflecting and talking about American Jews in the 1940s, 1950s, it seems as though a lot of that analysis is catered to the white American Jew, and you talk a lot about Black power and Jewish politics, and it feels as though there are no mentions of like Jews of color, Black Jews during that time, even though they were present. And I wonder what your thoughts about the way that was presented. And
yeah, thank you. It's an excellent question and observation, and it's absolutely accurate. And first, I'm going to just invite everyone to come back next week, because that is the epilogue of the Black Power book. Because, and I'll give you the thesis now, right? This is where I have failed in the historiography, because when I was sort of reading the earlier generations, and then I wrote the Quest for Inclusion book and then the Black Power book after that, it was all with an assumption of Jewish whiteness. And the moment one introduces Jews of color, one can't even use the phrase Black Jewish relations anymore, because the term Black Jewish relations implies Jewish whiteness in order to have a relationship with somebody else. And on a deeper level, what the Black Jewish phrase does is it removes a racial lens from understanding the American Jewish experience. And the next historiographic generation probably has to be a Jew of color who's going to write it. And they're going to go back through each of these time periods and rather I asked the questions about, what is it to be an American? Like when white Jews moved to the middle class and out to the suburbs, what happened, right? And the new question is, to what extent can we really best understand the history even of white Jews by looking at white racial privilege? And then once you do that, you're opening up, and you now must include Jews of color, because now we have contrasting experiences. Now we have everybody who's Jewish, but how they are faring on the American scene is differentiated by race. And that challenges Jewish studies professors from any assumptions they have of what is the Jewish part of whatever happened. For example, there's a lot of filial pietism, self-aggrandizing, that American Jews made it in America because we love education and we're hardworking, right? That's very congratulatory. Well, turns out actually Jews made it in America before most American Jews finished high school, which is to say the immigrants weren't going to school, and a lot of their kids like barely finished 7th or 8th grade or halfway through high school, they got to get to work. Jews made it in small business, and that permitted the next generation to finish high school and even go up to college. It wasn't education. Hard work is important, but guess what? Lots of immigrants have hard work. Maybe whiteness mattered there. And maybe the racial privilege is what was the engine that carried sociologically white American Jews upwards. So what I think the National Reckoning on Race is doing and will do in scholarship is force all of us now who wrote our books thinking that we were smart and the generation before us didn't get it, to be humble and now to rethink everything in a new context.
Wonderful. Thank you for your answer. We have a question from Bob Kaplan, and he says, any insights on Jews living in over socioeconomic communities in the 1950s, like Brownsville, Brooklyn, moving out once Blacks started to move in?
Right, thank you. And so first of all, it's a very bright group, and that's only because I actually have 4 different lectures. I'm doing 2 of them for you, and these questions are already jumping to the thesis points on all the other lectures. So I'm going to answer it now, and if I repeat it next week, please, it'll be good for the people who weren't here. Yes, that was the point, and this I think, Tari, goes to maybe the thesis you were proposing. Even though the racist restrictions on housing covenants were gone by a Supreme Court ruling, if it was a white Jewish neighborhood or any kind of white ethnic neighborhood in a city and a Black family moves in, all the white Jewish families are going to get out. They'll go to another urban area, they get out to the suburbs, right? And they'll claim, oh, I don't want housing prices to decline, right? And that's a nice way of saying, I'm being racist here right now. So yes, so this was the common practice. In fact, Jeff Gurok, who's a professor at Yeshiva University, has a great book called When Harlem Was Jewish, because Harlem was at a certain point a white Jewish neighborhood. And then when it became an African-American neighborhood, all the white Jews left. So one theory is, when you make it in America, you keep moving up and up and up, and that's supposedly independently a good thing if you keep going up. And what my scholarship is only beginning to do, and what the next generation has to do, is look at the complexity or the implications of that move up in terms of race and race relations in America. Thank you, Bob. Good question.
Well, thank you all so much. I know I have a ton of questions, but I'm also waiting for next week to hear Marc's next talk on Jews in the Black Power movement in the 1960s and 1970s. This is going to be next Wednesday, August 26th, again at 5 p.m. And the registration link is in the chat box, so please make sure to register for that. Marc and Tari, thank you so much for hosting us tonight and for all of the incredible information, and for Tari, your questions. So as you all hopefully know, the JCRC is absolutely committed to engaging in the work of racial equity, and we have many more programs lined up. We can't do this without your support, though. And so if you'd like to see more programs like the program tonight, we need your support. I'm really excited to say that we have a special promotion going on through the end of the month. And if you donate $180 or more to the JCRC, we will deliver a personalized and signed copy of Dr. Dollinger's most recent book, Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. It is a phenomenal read if you have not had a chance to read it. So if you'd like to make a donation, the link is in the chat box. And we hope to see you next week. So thank you everyone so much for joining us, and have a wonderful night.